Inside your skull sits the most mysterious object in the known universe, an organ capable of creating genius, twisting morality, unlocking impossible talent, and hiding powers so strange that even modern science still cannot fully explain them. And if the hidden power of the mind is real, then maybe the first place we should look is not at the brain of a genius, but at the brain we all begin with. One of the most humbling things I have ever realized about the human brain is that some of its greatest abilities may appear at the very beginning of life, long before we are old enough to recognize them, name them, or remember them. We tend to look at a newborn and see helplessness. We see fragility, dependence, softness, vulnerability. We see a tiny human being who cannot walk, cannot explain itself, cannot survive alone for even a short time. And because of that, it is easy to assume that intelligence comes later, that the real mind is something slowly built over time, something that arrives piece by piece as the child grows. But the deeper I look into the early brain, the less convincing that assumption becomes. Because what if infancy is not the absence of intelligence, but one of its purest forms? What if the baby's mind is not empty at all, but overflowing with raw potential? What if the brain begins life not in limitation, but in abundance? That possibility changes the emotional meaning of childhood in a way I cannot forget. Researchers studying infant development have shown something extraordinary. A newborn child appears to enter the world with the ability to detect and distinguish a far wider range of speech sounds than most adults can. Across the planet, human language is made from an astonishing variety of sounds, subtle shifts of tone, vowel shape, tongue placement, breath, rhythm, and pressure. Yet as adults, most of us become specialists. We grow fluent in the language around us, but in the process, we also become narrower. Our brains learn to focus on the sounds that matter most in our environment and slowly become less sensitive to others. A baby begins somewhere else entirely. At the start of life, the infant brain seems open to nearly all of it. It listens with an astonishing flexibility, as if it has not yet agreed to belong to one world over another. Before identity forms, before memory becomes stable, before culture settles in, the baby is already receiving reality at a level of openness that many adults never regain. And that is what grips me so deeply about this stage of life. The brain is not waiting to become remarkable. It already is. When I think about that, I stop hearing a baby's babbling as meaningless noise. I hear experimentation. I hear a mind testing the edges of human communication. I hear a young brain listening, storing, comparing, repeating, failing, adjusting, trying again. What sounds random to an adult may actually be one of the earliest expressions of a mind teaching itself how to enter the human world. The child hears patterns in voices all around it and begins to imitate them, not perfectly, not consciously in the way an older child studies, but with a relentless instinct that feels almost miraculous. That instinct matters, because it suggests that the infant brain is not passively receiving the world, it is actively building itself from it. This is where the idea of plasticity becomes so important. The early brain is often described as highly plastic, meaning flexible, rapidly changing, deeply responsive to experience. But even that word can feel too clinical for what is really taking place. Plasticity is not just a technical property. It is the reason the child can absorb language, emotion, rhythm, connection, and environmental patterns at such incredible speed. The infant mind is like a living field of possibility, shaped moment by touch, sound, expression, repetition, and emotional tone. Everything matters more in that stage because the architecture is still being built. And perhaps the most astonishing part is that this openness does not last. That is where the story turns, and where I think it becomes strangely emotional. Because as human beings grow, we do not only gain abilities, we also lose access to certain kinds of mental openness. The brain develops by pruning. It strengthens some pathways, discards others, becomes more efficient, more specialized, more focused. That specialization is useful. It helps us function. It allows us to navigate daily life without drowning in endless possibilities. But efficiency has a price. The wide-open sensitivity of the infant mind gradually narrows. What was once possible to hear, imitate, or absorb with ease may become harder, slower, or in some cases almost unreachable. In other words, development is not only expansion, it is selection. That thought has always stayed with me because it runs against the simple story we tell ourselves about intelligence. We like to imagine growth as a straight line upward, as though the older we become, the more complete the mind becomes. But the truth seems more complicated. In some ways, the adult brain is stronger, wiser, and more disciplined. In other ways, it is less open, less fluid, less able to hold the full range of possibility it once had. It has learned to survive by becoming efficient, but that efficiency may also conceal a kind of hidden loss. And maybe that is why so many people feel, without knowing how to describe it, that adulthood comes with a shrinking of something essential. Not just innocence, not just imagination, something deeper, a narrowing of perception, a hardening of patterns, a lessening of mental elasticity. Science does not romanticize childhood in the way nostalgia does, but it does point to a truth that is just as powerful. Early in life, the human mind is astonishingly receptive, and much of that receptivity fades as the brain becomes more specialized. That should make us stop and ask a much bigger question. What if growing up is not simply the story of becoming smarter, but also the story of becoming more filtered? What if the mind we call normal is not the mind at its fullest potential, but the mind after years of adaptation, narrowing, and pruning? What if many of the abilities we consider rare or exceptional are not entirely separate from us, but echoes of capacities the human brain once held more openly? That idea may sound dramatic, but the biology of infancy gives it real weight. Even physically, the newborn brain is a stunning thing. Relative to the body, it is enormous. Though the infant is tiny and dependent, the brain already demands extraordinary energy and resources. Nature appears to invest massively in the early mind, almost as if life itself recognizes that this stage is sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a developmental one. It is a period when the brain is absorbing the structure of reality with incredible intensity. Voices, faces, safety, stress, rhythm, touch, language, affection, fear, all of it begins shaping the nervous system long before the child can tell a story about any of it. That is what makes infancy feel so profound to me. A baby may look quiet from the outside, but on the inside, one of the most complex transformations in existence is unfolding. The mind is organizing sound into meaning, emotion into attachment, repetition into memory, and sensation into the first hidden foundations of identity. Before the child can even say I, the machinery of self is already being assembled, and maybe that is one of the deepest hidden truths of all. The human mind begins life closer to pure possibility than it will ever be again. Not because babies know more than adults, they do not, but because their brains remain open in ways ours no longer are. They are not yet locked into the habits, assumptions, and rigid pathways that define so much of later life. They are still becoming, still absorbing, still unconsciously reaching into a wider field of human capacity. The more I think about that, the more I wonder how much of our so-called ordinary mind is actually a reduced version of something larger. How much potential lies buried beneath efficiency? How much intuition, creativity, or sensitivity is not destroyed but simply covered over by the demands of adaptation? And if the early brain already contains this much mystery, then what happens when the structure of the mind is altered in far more dramatic ways, through trauma, damage, or sudden neurological change? Because sometimes, when the brain breaks its usual rules, it does not only lose something. Sometimes, disturbingly, it seems to reveal something that was hidden there all along. And it is in those rare moments, when the brain is shaken, damaged, or forced out of its ordinary patterns, that some of its most unsettling secrets begin to surface. There are certain stories that refuse to leave you once you hear them, not because they are merely tragic, and not because they are sensational, but because they break something in the way you thought the human mind was supposed to work. I think that is why some of the most unforgettable cases in the study of the brain are not the ones that confirm what we already believe, but the ones that seem to violate it. The ones that make the brain feel less like a machine and more like a hidden world full of locked doors, some of which should never open, and some of which perhaps reveal abilities we never knew were there. One of the earliest and most shocking examples came nearly 2 centuries ago, in 1848, with a man named Phineas Gage. Gage was a railroad foreman, a practical man doing dangerous work in a brutal era of expansion and industry. His job involved packing explosive charges into rock so new railway lines could be built. It was hard, physical labor, and on one ordinary day, in one ordinary moment, everything changed. A mistake during the blasting process caused an explosion that sent a tamping iron straight through his face, through his skull, and out the top of his head. It is almost impossible to picture the violence of that event without feeling a chill. A long iron rod tore through the front portion of his brain, leaving behind the kind of injury that should have ended his life instantly. And yet he did not die. That fact alone feels almost unreal, but what has always haunted me is not only that he survived, it is what his survival seemed to reveal. Before the accident, Gage was described as responsible, capable, disciplined, someone trusted with serious work. After the injury, accounts suggested he was changed. Something about his personality, his judgment, his emotional stability no longer felt like the same man people had known before. He remained alive, but a crucial part of the self others recognized seemed damaged, altered, displaced. That case mattered because it exposed something we still struggle to accept. Personality is not some untouchable force floating above the body. Restraint, judgment, patience, social awareness, the invisible qualities we often think of as character, all of them are tied to living tissue. Change that tissue, and sometimes you change the person. I think that is one of the most unsettling truths in all of neuroscience. We want to believe that who we are is solid, that identity is somehow protected from the fragile material of the body. But the story of Phineas Gage suggests otherwise. It suggests that what we call the self may depend far more heavily than we realize on structures so delicate that a single accident can alter them forever. And yet, as disturbing as Gage's story is, it points mostly toward loss. Loss of stability, loss of what once was. What becomes even harder to explain are the cases where injury does not simply take something away, but seems to uncover something extraordinary. That is where the brain becomes truly mysterious to me. In modern times, one of the most frequently discussed cases of this kind is Derek Amato. Before his accident, he was not known as a musical prodigy. He lived an ordinary life, worked ordinary jobs, moved through the world without any sign that he was secretly carrying the mind of a concert-level musician inside him. Then, in 2006, after diving into a swimming pool and striking his head, his life changed dramatically. The injury caused serious consequences, including hearing loss and cognitive disruption. By any normal standard, this was a traumatic event, not a gift. But what happened afterward made his story unforgettable. Amato began experiencing sound and music in a radically different way. According to his account, he became drawn to the piano with an intensity that had not existed before, and he seemed able to perceive musical structures internally, almost as if the language of music had suddenly become visible to him from within. This was not the slow, familiar path of years of disciplined training. It was something stranger, something more abrupt, as if a hidden circuit in the brain had been switched on after years of silence. Cases like this are sometimes associated with acquired savant syndrome, in which a person develops remarkable abilities following injury or neurological change. The abilities can involve music, mathematics, memory, art, spatial reasoning, or pattern recognition. These cases are rare, and we should be careful with them. They are not fairy tales. They emerge from pain, confusion, medical trauma, and lives that are often permanently altered. No one should romanticize the suffering that comes with severe brain injury. But even with that caution, it is impossible to look away from what such cases imply, because they force an almost unbearable question into the open. If an apparently ordinary person can experience a major neurological disruption and then begin demonstrating extraordinary talent, where did that talent come from? Was it created by the injury? Or was it already present in some hidden form, waiting behind mechanisms of the ordinary mind that were suddenly weakened, bypassed, or rearranged? That question has stayed with me because it does not only change the way we think about rare cases, it changes the way we think about all people. Maybe genius is not always a completely separate category of human being. Maybe some part of what we call extraordinary ability exists more widely than we realize, but remains buried under filters, habits, survival patterns, and ordinary neural constraints. Maybe the brain is constantly editing reality, narrowing access, reducing noise, helping us function in the world efficiently, even if that efficiency comes at the cost of suppressing deeper forms of pattern recognition or expression. If that possibility is true, even in part, then the ordinary mind may not be the full mind. It may only be the manageable mind. I find that idea both thrilling and unsettling. Thrilling because it hints that the human brain may contain far more untapped potential than our daily lives reveal. Unsettling because it suggests that the line between normal and extraordinary may depend on mechanisms we do not control and barely understand. We prefer stories in which talent arrives clearly, early, and predictably. We like the comfort of believing that great ability is obvious from childhood, that genius announces itself in familiar ways. But the brain does not always respect those clean narratives. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it waits, sometimes it emerges only after the self has been violently interrupted. And maybe that is why stories like Gage and Amato feel so powerful when placed side by side. One shows us that damage can fracture a person. The other suggests that damage can, in rare cases, reveal something astonishing. Together, they expose the same deeper truth. The brain is not simple. It is not stable in the way we imagine. It is not a straightforward machine with one predictable response to one kind of event. It is adaptable, vulnerable, layered, and still full of locked processes we do not understand. That makes the human mind feel at once more fragile and more expansive than most people realize. And perhaps that is the real hidden truth here. Not that injury is magical, and not that every person carries a secret genius waiting for a blow to the head. That would be reckless and false. The deeper truth is that the brain contains depths we have barely mapped. What appears fixed may not be fixed. What appears absent may not be absent. What appears ordinary may conceal extraordinary capacities that life never gives a chance to surface. But this mystery has another side, and it is much darker. Because if the brain can contain hidden reserves of beauty, music, and brilliance, then it may also contain hidden pathways to violence, distortion, and moral collapse. If a changed brain can reveal genius, then a changed brain can also reveal something far more frightening. And that is where this journey becomes harder, because the next question is not what makes a mind gifted, it is what makes a mind dangerous. And once you begin asking what gives the mind its brilliance, it becomes impossible to avoid the darker question of what happens when the same mind begins to lose its grip on conscience. This is the part of the story that I find the hardest to sit with, because it forces us to look at the human brain not as a source of wonder alone, but as the place where some of our deepest horrors may also begin. It is one thing to imagine the brain as the birthplace of genius, music, imagination, and hidden potential. It is another to ask whether that same organ can also help explain cruelty, predatory behavior, and the chilling absence of empathy. And the more I think about it, the more I feel that this may be one of the most uncomfortable hidden truths of all. The distance between human greatness and human darkness may be far smaller and far more biological than we want to believe. For most of us, evil feels like something abstract until it wears a human face, and that is why certain criminal cases become so disturbing in the public imagination. Not simply because of what was done, but because of who appears to have done it. We expect monsters to look monstrous. We expect violence to announce itself. We want to believe that danger can be recognized at a glance. But history repeatedly shows us something much more unnerving. Sometimes the most dangerous people are not the ones who look visibly broken or chaotic. Sometimes they are calm, articulate, socially skilled, even charismatic. That contradiction shakes something deep inside us because it suggests that the surface of a person tells us far less than we want it to. Ted Bundy became one of the most infamous examples of that contradiction in modern American history. He was not remembered only because of his crimes, but because of the disturbing contrast between outward appearance and inner reality. He could appear intelligent, composed, persuasive, even approachable. And that is what makes his case linger in the mind. It reminds us that the human brain can hold two different worlds at once: the social mask people see and the hidden structure underneath that may be operating by entirely different rules. I think that is one reason the study of violent minds matters so much. It is not about sensationalizing evil. It is about confronting a deeply human question. What has to go wrong inside the brain for another person's pain to stop mattering? That question has driven researchers for decades. Among the most influential figures in this field is Adrian Raine, whose work examining the brains of violent offenders helped bring neuroscience into direct conversation with criminal behavior. Using imaging techniques that allowed researchers to study both brain structure and function, Raine and others found patterns suggesting that some violent individuals showed reduced activity or abnormalities in regions associated with judgment, impulse control, and emotional regulation, especially the prefrontal cortex. That part of the brain matters more than most people realize. The prefrontal cortex sits behind the forehead and plays a major role in restraint. It helps us pause before acting on anger. It helps us weigh consequences. It helps us imagine what another person is feeling. It helps organize the difference between impulse and decision, between rage and control, between urge and morality. In a very real sense, it is one of the systems that helps make civilization possible inside the individual mind. So when that system functions poorly, the effects can be devastating. A weaker or impaired prefrontal system does not automatically create a violent criminal, and I want to be very careful here. Human behavior is never that simple. But what these findings do suggest is that morality is not floating somewhere outside the body. It is grounded, at least in part, in circuitry. Empathy requires functioning systems. Self-control requires functioning systems. The ability to regulate aggression, fear, shame, and desire depends on a brain capable of doing that work. And once you accept that, the old fantasy that good and evil exist in complete separation from biology becomes much harder to defend. To me, that is not a reduction of human responsibility. It is a deepening of the picture, because biology is only one part of the story. The other part is environment, and this is where things become even more complicated. A vulnerable brain may still develop in healthy ways under stable conditions. A strong brain may still be damaged by chaos, neglect, abuse, fear, humiliation, or chronic instability. Human beings are shaped not only by the tissue they are born with, but by the world that trains that tissue over time. Stress, trauma, violence in the home, emotional deprivation, and distorted social bonds can leave marks that are not merely psychological. They can become biological through development itself. This is why childhood matters so much, especially in the formation of conscience. When a child is raised in an environment where trust is broken, where fear dominates, where love is unstable, or where aggression is normalized, the developing brain adapts to that reality. It learns vigilance instead of safety. It may learn control through domination instead of empathy. It may build defensive strategies that make emotional connection weaker and threat detection stronger. Over time, those patterns do not remain abstract. They become part of how the nervous system functions. That is one reason the life histories of violent offenders are so often filled with emotional fracture. Not always, and not in every case, but often enough to force us to pay attention. When people later ask whether someone was born evil or made evil, I think the question itself may be too shallow. In many cases, what we are really looking at is an interaction between predisposition and environment, between neurological vulnerability and developmental damage, between a brain that may already struggle in certain areas and a world that pushes it further in the wrong direction. And that is where the conversation becomes morally difficult. Because once we admit that the brain and environment both shape the capacity for empathy and restraint, then we have to ask what justice, prevention, and responsibility should look like in a society that understands this. If one day neuroscience becomes accurate enough to identify children who may be at higher risk for severe impulsivity, emotional detachment, or violent behavior, what would we do with that knowledge? Would we use it to help early, with compassion and support? Or would we turn it into another form of fear, stigma, and social exile? I think that question matters because it reveals something profound about how we define evil. Most people are comfortable discussing violent individuals only after the damage is done. Much fewer are willing to confront the earlier stages, when prevention might still be possible, when care, stability, intervention, and healthy emotional development might make the difference. It is easier to condemn the final outcome than to invest seriously in the conditions that help prevent it. But if the brain is part of the story, then prevention must also be part of the story. That does not mean excusing those who commit terrible crimes. Responsibility remains essential. Victims matter. Safety matters. Law matters. But understanding is not the same thing as excuse. In fact, I would argue the opposite. The more seriously we understand the roots of violence, the more seriously we can take the work of preventing it. And still, even after all of this, I find myself unsettled by something deeper. because the hidden truth here is not only that violent behavior may reflect damaged empathy or impaired control. It is that what we call conscience itself may be more fragile than we ever wanted to admit. The qualities we praise as moral strength may depend on systems that require care, stability, healthy development, and biological integrity. We like to imagine goodness as something solid and purely chosen, but perhaps part of goodness is also maintenance. A functioning mind, a well-developed capacity to feel others, a nervous system not completely shaped by fear and damage. That is a humbling thought. It means that what keeps many people humane may not be some guaranteed inner purity, but the quiet success of countless invisible conditions working properly together. Healthy emotional attachment, stable development, neural regulation, social boundaries, learned empathy, a brain able to pause, reflect, and imagine consequences before harm is done. And if that is true, then the brain is not only the source of intelligence or creativity, it is also one of the battlegrounds where civilization is either preserved or lost inside the individual. That may be the darkest lesson in this entire journey. The brain does not only determine how brightly a person can think, it may also influence how deeply a person can care. And yet, even here, at the edge of morality and violence, the story of the brain refuses to become simple. Because beyond genius and beyond criminality, there remains another category of mystery altogether, one that pushes us out of familiar science and into a far more controversial frontier, where intuition, hidden perception, and even the future of consciousness itself begin to enter the conversation. And after everything the brain has already shown us, genius, trauma, morality, and the fragile machinery of conscience, we arrive at one final threshold where science, mystery, and the future of human identity begin to blur together. This is the part of the subject that fascinates me most because it is where our confidence starts to fail. Up to a point, we can still pretend the brain is something we are steadily decoding. We can study language, development, memory, injury, and behavior and tell ourselves that progress is being made. But at the outer edge of the mind, the questions become stranger than the answers. Perception that seems to reach beyond ordinary explanation, intuition that feels too precise to ignore. The possibility that consciousness itself might one day be copied, simulated, or preserved. And suddenly the story of the brain no longer feels like biology alone. It starts to feel like a confrontation with what it means to exist. One of the subjects that people tend to either believe too quickly or dismiss too quickly is clairvoyance, sometimes described as remote perception. The idea that the mind may, in rare cases, access information without relying on the ordinary senses. I have never found blind belief convincing, but I have also never found reflexive dismissal particularly impressive. What keeps drawing me back is not certainty. It is the fact that the question refuses to disappear. Across cultures and across time, people have repeatedly returned to the suspicion that the mind may be capable of more than our current models allow. There are stories of individuals describing distant places, sensing events far away, or knowing details they should not reasonably know. Many such claims are difficult to verify. Some are likely exaggerations, coincidences, unconscious pattern recognition, or misunderstood experiences. But even after allowing for all of that, the fascination remains. And that, to me, says something important. We keep circling this possibility because the human mind already feels larger than our explanations of it. What makes this even more intriguing is that interest in such phenomena did not remain limited to fringe circles. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States reportedly explored psychic research, especially remote viewing. That fact matters to me not because it proves the claims were true, but because it shows how seriously powerful institutions were willing to entertain the possibility. Governments do not usually invest attention in ideas they consider completely beneath consideration. However uncertain the results were, the possibility that the mind might extract information in unusual ways was considered important enough to explore. That is where Project Stargate becomes so fascinating. It remains one of the strangest intersections of psychology, espionage, and human ambition. The idea that intelligence agencies would test individuals believed to have unusual perceptual abilities sounds like fiction, yet it belongs to the history of an era defined by paranoia, strategic competition, and the search for any possible advantage. What interests me most is not whether every claim surrounding those programs was true. It is what those programs reveal about human thought itself. Even in systems built on technology, military logic, and data, there was still a persistent curiosity about whether the mind might do something extraordinary that machines could not. And perhaps that is because ordinary life already hints at something difficult to explain. Intuition, for example, is real. Not necessarily in the dramatic way popular culture likes to portray it, but real in the sense that the brain is constantly processing far more than conscious awareness can track. It notices patterns, inconsistencies, emotional tone, danger signals, and subtle details before the conscious mind catches up. Sometimes what feels like a premonition may simply be the brain arriving at a conclusion before you can explain why. But that does not make the mystery smaller. It makes it stranger. It means the mind you consciously experience may only be the surface of a much deeper processing system. Beneath awareness, countless interpretations may already be shaping judgment, instinct, and response long before you can put them into words. That alone is astonishing. But the final frontier is even more profound, because it asks not only what the brain can sense, but whether the brain itself can one day be preserved, copied, or rebuilt outside the body. This is where the conversation turns toward one of the most ambitious and unsettling ideas in modern science: whole brain emulation. In simple terms, the idea is that if we could map the brain in enough detail, every neuron, every synapse, every crucial pattern of activity, then perhaps we could simulate its function in a machine. Not just imitate isolated behaviors, not just reproduce speech, but recreate something closer to the operating architecture of a human mind. The scale of that challenge is almost impossible to grasp. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each woven into vast, changing networks. This immense web of neural connections is often called the connectomy. If we could fully map it, we would possess one of the most extraordinary scientific blueprints ever created: a structural map of the machinery behind memory, thought, personality, and identity. But for now, that goal remains far beyond us. We can scan broad brain activity, study smaller systems, and model fragments, but the complete human brain still stands ahead of us like a landscape hidden in fog. And yet the idea continues to attract people because the implications are so enormous. If memory can be mapped, if behavioral patterns can be modeled, if neural states can be preserved with increasing precision, then one day, humanity may try to do something previous generations would have considered impossible. We may attempt to upload the contents of a mind. That is where the question becomes truly unsettling. Imagine a machine that could hold your memories, your emotional associations, your language patterns, your preferences, even your style of humor. Imagine it could answer the way you answer, remember what you remember, and speak with an uncanny reflection of your inner life. Would that still be you? That question is difficult to escape because identity may not be reducible to information alone. A perfect copy of your memories might still only be a copy. If the biological brain dies and a digital version remains, what exactly has survived? Has consciousness continued? Has awareness truly crossed over? Or has something else appeared? A new entity built from your pattern, while the original you still ends where the living brain ends? I do not think that question can be answered by engineering alone. It touches the oldest human uncertainty of all. What is the self? Is it memory, continuity, pattern, soul, a biological process, a story the brain tells itself, or something even stranger that we do not yet have the language to describe? This is why the study of the brain becomes, in the end, more than science. It becomes a meditation on existence itself. The infant brain shows us raw possibility. Injury shows us how identity can fracture or transform. Moral neuroscience shows us that empathy and restraint may depend on delicate systems we often take for granted. And the future now forces us to ask whether the mind can be separated from the body, whether consciousness can be reconstructed, and whether a human being is ultimately biological, informational, or something irreducibly singular. For me, the deepest hidden truth is not that the brain contains one secret power waiting to be unlocked. It is that the brain remains unfinished territory. It is the frontier behind every other frontier. We use it to explore the universe, invent machines, create music, form laws, commit crimes, fall in love, fear death, and imagine immortality. It is the instrument through which every human question is asked. And yet, for all our progress, we are still standing outside its innermost chambers, trying to guess what is happening within. That realization is both humbling and beautiful, because it means the greatest mystery may not be hidden in distant galaxies or buried beneath the earth. It may be sitting behind your eyes right now, generating the reality you experience, shaping the person you call yourself, and withholding from you the full extent of what it has been capable of all along. And maybe that is the final reason the brain has such a hold on me. The more I search for hidden truths, the more I return here, to the one mystery we carry everywhere, the one mystery through which all other mysteries must pass. The human brain is not just something we have. It may be the deepest unknown we are, and perhaps that is the lesson that matters most. We should stop treating the mind as fixed. Too many people live as if their habits, limits, and emotional patterns are permanent. But the story of the brain suggests something very different. The mind is shaped by repetition, environment, attention, experience, and the stories we keep feeding it. The brain is always listening to how we live. That makes the lesson practical, not just philosophical. If you want a stronger mind, protect what you allow into it. If you want more clarity, pay attention to what you repeat every day. If you want greater balance, stop treating stress, chaos, poor sleep, and constant distraction as harmless. If you want the mind to grow, give it something worth growing toward. Reflection, discipline, meaningful conversation, deep reading, curiosity, creative work, and silence away from noise. The brain adapts to the life built around it. In that sense, the life you practice becomes the mind you live inside. And one more lesson matters just as much: humility. Humility with yourself and with others. You never fully know what someone is carrying inside the mind, what shaped them, what wounded them, what hidden potential they hold, or what battles they are fighting. The brain is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. That should make us more intentional, more compassionate, and more responsible in how we live. So here is a simple question. Do you believe the human brain is still hiding abilities we do not fully understand? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear your perspective, and I think others would too. And if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Hidden Truth channel to support the channel and help keep these deeper explorations coming.